This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, Catherine Love is a freelance arts journalist and theatre critic whose work has appeared in The Guardian, Stage, Time Out. Alongside her freelance work, she's studying part-time, still studying, finished?
Coming towards the end.
Coming towards the end of a part-time MA in Theatre and Performance at Queen Mary. And she will talk to us about authority and authorship, popular critical responses to Shakespeare in performance. So, handing over to our speakers.
Right, so as you just heard, I'm kind of here in two guises today, both as postgraduate researcher and as a critic myself, which is probably worth kind of just bearing in mind in the background of everything that I'm saying today. So I want to start with a bit of a provocation. The introduction to W.B. Worthen's drama Between Poetry and Performance opens with the contentious statement that, quote, in the English-speaking world, the worst thing that ever happened to drama was Shakespeare. Worthen is quick to add, in parenthesis, that Shakespeare was also the best thing to happen to English drama, but his first point remains. He elaborates, quote, the densely verbal conventions of early modern playwriting and the cultural celebration of Shakespeare's plays as literature more or less ever since have distorted the place of writing, of scripted language and our understanding of drama and dramatic performance. The same could be said, I would argue, of the long shadow that Shakespeare continues to cast over British theatre criticism, just as Worthen claims that, quote, the centrality of Shakespeare to English language and literary and theatre studies provides a paradigm of the understanding of drama in foreign culture. It is my claim that the mainstream critical approach to Shakespeare within British theatre culture, by which I'm sort of generalising, but the point stands, and its latent anxieties about text, authorship and authority are paradigmatic of the ways in which popular criticism tends to understand and position the theatre text, tendencies which, if left unquestioned, threaten to congeal into something like orthodoxy. To demonstrate the persistence of these anxieties within British theatre criticism, I would like to turn briefly to the example of Knee-High's 2006 version of Cymbeline. Commissioned by the Royal Shakespeare Company for its Complete Works Festival, the show was billed as a response to Shakespeare's play. Much of its original verse was cut by Knee-High, who instead created their own adaptation in partnership with the writer Carl Gross. The responses of critics to this textual intervention, both in Stratford-upon-Avon and after the production's transfer to London in 2007, was mixed but revealing. The Guardian's Michael Billington dismissed the show as, quote, coarsely reductive, describing it as a paraphrase and lamenting the loss of, quote, Shakespeare's own mysterious experimental genius. Charles Spencer, writing for The Telegraph, damningly sees Knee-High's departure from Shakespeare's language as, quote, characteristic of everything that is lazy and second-rate about our culture. While his scant praise has saved the moment in which, quote, the play achieves a genuinely Shakespearean glow. While many other critics relish Knee-High's experimental approach, the language they use to commend it is equally telling. Dominic Cavendish, Spencer's colleague at The Telegraph, enthusiastically describes how Shakespeare's text has been, quote, decapitated, as though the bard were a tyrannical monarch who needed beheading. There are similarly negative connotations attached to Guardian critic Lynn Gardner's admiring the phrase theatrical graffiti, implying cultural vandalism, while Claire Alfrey at Metro opts for, quote, lewd bastardisation. The implication of something somehow illicit about Knee-High's adaptation recurs. Paul Taylor at The Independent is pleased that the company have retained, quote, those moments of beauty in Shakespeare, where it would be a crime to deviate from the original. And where Knee-High succeed in their revisions, it is because they have seized on the heart of Shakespeare's play, an image deployed by both Cavendish and Alfrey. In her recent book, Theatre Making, Dushka Radosavljevic discusses the same production and its critical reception in both Stratford and London. She concludes, optimistically, that perhaps there is a shift beginning in 2006 and 2007 in how critics view Shakespearean performance, noting that, quote, what some of the younger critics were picking up from Knee-High's Cymbeline was the way in which the company discovered the cardiac centre and the spirit of the play without resort to Shakespeare's dialogue. And this idea of the spirit of the play is something I'll return to later, and I also kind of resonates with some of the discussions from this morning about the spirit of the play and translation.
Sorry, Catherine, can you speak on the
Oh,
mic?
sorry.
Thank you.
But does this increased receptiveness to theatrical interpretation actually represent a changed understanding of Shakespeare's authority, and how much has really shifted in recent years? For the remainder of this paper, I would like to keep those questions in mind while focusing on a key cultural moment for both the performance and the reception of Shakespeare in the UK. At the heart of the London 2012 Festival, which was the culmination of the Cultural Olympiad in the run-up to the London 2012 Olympic Games, was the World Shakespeare Festival, produced by the Royal Shakespeare Company and involving 69 international productions. The festival claimed to be the biggest celebration of Shakespeare ever staged. As I briefly discussed, reviews of Shakespeare might offer a paradigmatic example of how British theatre critics configure the authority of the text. I would also like to suggest that productions of Shakespeare from different cultures and staged in different languages allow a particularly acute insight into how critics in this country understand the sanctity or otherwise of Shakespeare's plays. As Michael Billington discusses in a review of the Russian production of The Globe, quote, foreign language Shakespeare, necessarily an adaptation, often has a liberating effect for directors and actors. Faced with these liberated productions, the responses of critics often animate the tensions around the text and its authority, which might otherwise remain inert beneath widely shared cultural assumptions about Shakespearean performance. The World Shakespeare Festival, therefore, provides a fertile site for exploring just how these underlying ideas of authorship and authority might make themselves felt. To do so, I will draw on 3 examples from the festival: Dmitry Krymov Lab's radical reworking of Midsummer Night's Dream, Catalan director Calixto Vieto's Forests, which pieced together various imaginings of the forest from Shakespeare's work, and the Globe to Globe Festival, bringing together productions of Shakespeare's plays performed in 37 different languages. Dmitry Krymov's A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, is, in the words of the Times' Sam Marlowe, quote, a meditation on the codes, etiquette and processes of theatre itself, and on Shakespeare as cultural icon. And that's significant. That final point is significant here if we're thinking about Shakespeare's authority. The playful opening, in which familiar items of scenery associated with the play, such as a tree, an ornamental fountain, are dragged through the audience and then discarded, is an immediate nod to the work's performance genealogy. The play is then re-centred around Mechanical's telling of the tragedy as lovers Pyramus and Thisbe, who are realised as 2 towering puppets. The show's critical reception was largely positive, but the author hovers in the background of much of the praise. Michael Billington describes the production as, quote, not your average Shakespeare, but a hilarious piece of controlled anarchy. Despite the rearrangement of the drama, he is pleased to see that Krymov has faithfully followed the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, and suggests that, quote, what is so seductive about Krymov is his Shakespearean ability to blend high and low art. It's interesting that Krymov's brilliance, according to Billington, lies, at least in part, in his display of qualities seen to be possessed by Shakespeare. Ian Shuttleworth of the Financial Times, meanwhile, enjoys the production despite misgivings. His fear that A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, will be, quote, the most self-indulgent kind of director's theatre, says a lot about how British critics tend to view the authority of the director in relation to that of the author, particularly when that author is Shakespeare. And it might be worth pausing to note that you rarely hear similar complaints about self-indulgent writers' theatre. But it is Pat Ashworth on stage who displays perhaps the most deference to Shakespeare's genius, describing Cramel's production as, quote, a teasing, brain-testing juxtaposition of comedy and tragedy. That is the very essence of Shakespeare. What the essence of Shakespeare might be in this context is not specified, but it echoes the vaguely mythologizing language that is frequently used in discussions of Shakespeare, and recalls Worthen's list of the absent author's many stand-ins, quote, the text, genre, myth, essence, spirit. We have the idea of spirit again. Joyce Macmillan of The Scotsman, however, hints at the potentially liberating creativity that an approach such as Cramel's can allow, when she describes his, quote, joyous, anarchic, and completely alive and beautiful 90-minute response to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. The vital, in all senses word here, is alive, marking a contrast with frequent complaints that creaky productions of classics are lacking animation. And this life is sparked, as is suggested, through a response to, rather than the slavishly faithful production of the play. if indeed we can even talk of fidelity when dealing with plays that are 4 centuries old. While Krimov's rendering of A Midsummer Night's Dream dramatically shifted the focus of the play, Calixto Vieto's Forests borrowed from multiple Shakespeare texts. What linked these snippets of verse together, as the title suggests, was the setting of a forest, an alternately magical, liminal, and dangerous space. Vieto's production had a much cooler reception than Krimov's. Kay Kellaway in The Observer admires the boldness of his concept, but gives all the credit of its success to the timeless adaptability of Shakespeare's plays, and, quote, his words pliant as willow. When the show fails, meanwhile, it is down to Vieto's, quote, failure to acknowledge Shakespearean hinterlands. Michael Billington acknowledges that this is Vieto's Shakespeare, offering attention to what the director has crafted, but he is most thrilled by what Vieto, quote, discovers in Shakespeare, the implication being that the director's role is simply to illuminate the genius that emanates from Shakespeare rather than from any other source. And what Billington misses in this production is, quote, that uniquely Shakespearean ability to find irony and humour in moments of darkest tragedy. Dominic Maxwell in The Times uses the same terms as Billington, but dismissively instead of praisingly. It's more Vietto than Shakespeare, he complains, going on to call the production a stylish dud. Any praise, meanwhile, is reserved for Shakespeare's poetry. The stage's Heather Neal reaches a strikingly similar conclusion about the power of poetry that emerges from a production that is otherwise a bit of a mixed bag, in her opinion. She says, one comes away having shed a strange, oblique slant on Shakespeare's preoccupation with mortality, and, once again, relishing his language. To turn once again to Worthen, he argues in Shakespeare and the Authorship performance that critics, among others who describe performance, quote, invoke surprisingly literary valuations of a stable text and an intending author. Whereas he suggests if we look at the range of different performance texts used over the centuries, it does not look quite so stable after all. Worthen continues, quote, the sense that performance transmits Shakespearean authority remains very much in play, most strongly perhaps when the ostensibly free and disruptive authority of the stage is at hand. In other words, it may be when performance appears to take most license with the text that the spectre of Shakespearean authority makes its presence most strongly felt. We can witness this in the critical responses to A Midsummer Night's Dream As You Like It and Forests, both of which, and I mean the productions here, would seem to be liberated from any prescriptive sense of fidelity to Shakespeare's texts. Even when these irreverent performance strategies are praised, however, the ghostly figure of the author rears its head. Approval or condemnation, in the majority of cases, is doled out in alignment with the mysterious, in inverted commas idea of Shakespeare. The globe-to-globe season at Shakespeare's Globe may not have always taken such striking approaches to Shakespeare's plays in terms of sort of changing the central structure of them, but its translation of the Bard's work into numerous different languages and cultures revealed much about how we in this country position both the authority and the celebrated universality of these plays. And I think, as a number of people did this morning, it's worth putting a big question mark next to that universality. While it is impossible to capture the range of work involved in this festival within the scope of this paper, a few selected examples offer further instances of the tensions and anxieties that I've been tentatively exploring. One recurring reservation about the globe-to-globe productions, which were all shorn down to fit into 2-hour slots and often adopted a broad brushstrokes approach to make performances as accessible as possible to speakers of all languages, was the absence of what were perceived to be core Shakespearean qualities. To give just 2 examples, Michael Billington says of the Lithuanian Hamlet, quote, what I missed was the polychromatic diversity of Shakespeare's indestructible play, while Andrew Dixon, reviewing Arcana's production of All's Well That Ends Well, quote, missed some of the play's finer-grained subtleties. While these might be perfectly reasonable criticisms, it is interesting to note that the productions are repeatedly held up to an ideal example of the text, supposing once again that the play, or perhaps its spirit, represents a fixed entity. In 2 reviews of Q Brothers' hip-hop version of Othello, meanwhile, an interesting relationship is sketched between interpretation and original text, though once again it is slightly misleading to discuss a single, stable, original work. For Kieran Yates in The Guardian, what the hip-hop treatment of the play ultimately discovers is that, quote, Shakespeare himself is a master of rhythm and rhyme. The languages of Shakespearean verse and American hip-hop, according to this critic, quote, aren't so different at all. And I wonder here if it's also worth pausing to sort of think about the danger of eliding cultural specificity by constantly returning to this idea of Shakespeare's authority. So there might be a kind of cultural hierarchy of legitimation depending on how closely they evoke that authority. Tom Green in Telegraph similarly emphasises the strength of the link with Shakespeare, drawing attention to the fact, as pointed out in the production, that the Key brothers, quote, are part of a tradition of reworking familiar stories that Shakespeare himself borrowed from the Greeks. However, he then concludes, based on the quality of the production, that, quote, if the writers felt they needed to justify touching one of Shakespeare's finest plays, they needn't have bothered. Justification is a central idea here, as much for critics as for theatre makers. What we witness time and again, even when it appears to be resisted, is an appeal or deference to the authority of the text or of Shakespeare. But, as Wortham points out, we are so distant from that authority, which is itself so unstable and multiple, that to deem any production truly authoritative is a disingenuous claim. Instead, Wortham describes this notion of Shakespeare, in inverted commas again, as, quote, a necessary fiction that organises and stabilises this interpretive community, working not to provide access to privileged meaning, but to legitimate the relationship between actor and text, between spectator and stage, between critic and performance. This impulse among critics to seek legitimation, fidelity, or justification seems to run counter to the multifaceted, collaborative nature of theatre as an art form, which consists of much more than simply a text and its meanings. And to reinforce that impulse runs the risk of trapping theatre makers with a fiercely prescriptive set of rules. Or, as Wortham puts it, quote, to think of performance as conveying authorised meanings of any kind, especially meanings authenticated in and by the text, is, finally, to tame the unruly ways of the stage. This is inevitably a limited picture of the British critical response to Shakespeare across different cultures, and its implications for our understanding of both Shakespeare and performance, and the relationship between text and performance. What I hope it's begun to illustrate, however, is the ways in which the critical establishment often remains enthralled to the authority of Shakespeare and the play text in general, with potentially limiting effects for the creativity of those artists seeking a more inventive and irreverent approach to the words on the page. After opening with a provocation, I want to end on a question directed as much at myself, a critic who has doubtless been guilty on occasion of the same tendencies I identify in others, as at anyone else. What might reviews of Shakespeare, and theatre criticism more widely, gain from throwing off the shackles of the text and its constraining authority?
I invite Aneta first. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think it was really interesting, and I'm so happy we've had three different perspectives. And building up also on what Steve Purcell was talking about, language and the notion of transmittability and the whole themes of the conference, I was really struck by this notion of the difference between German versus British reviewing, and I'm wondering whether we should maybe go further and kind of look at different languages of reviewing within Europe. I was really struck when I was working on a project on European performance, reading reviews from Italy of productions, whereas, versus, let's say, British or German or Polish, they would be very, very different, and they'd be looking at very different things. And I'm just kind of interested in whether you would, agree with this kind of comment that it's just not just the German, British, but kind of there's this whole diversity, and whether you notice any maybe differences from outside of Europe, like if you've read any reviews from like differences between the States versus Britain, and if you would have any comments on that.
My French is rusty, so I haven't really looked up outside, and must admit, but I guess what I would...
It's working now, come on.
I guess I kind of made a really clear distinction between British and European, and that's not, I agree, that's probably not really, so I'm not sure. It would be great to have, Estelle here to maybe talk about that, but I don't know. Well, you said you read Polish, or into Polish reviewing. What can you say about it? I can't really.
I'm very struck how the Italian reviews read. They're very poetic and very aesthetic, and you're always struck by how little you get about the detail of the production, and you always kind of have this beautiful, the monument of human beauty shining through, and
nationalism.
I know, but it's true. So I'm sometimes like looking at it and like, whoa, this is poetic, and this is a Italian review. Whereas the British reviewers would be sort of focusing more on the detail. There would be a certain catchphrase. And I'm also interested in kind of linguistic aspect of it, because I thought it was very interesting how you were mentioning certain catchphrases, like within like of the generation. I was wondering if in German sort of there are like catchphrases coming out as well, because I think there's a sense of vocabulary as sort of like certain cliches being placed, like fast-paced action, like lively performance, and kind of you feel from that. And I'm wondering if German reviewing operates in a similar manner.
I'm not sure. I think one of the striking things is that in local journalism, definitely. So if you have a local culture journalist doing the same 300-word review, then you have that. But in the national newspapers, I think they're very aware of these kind of cliches. So what they're really doing, they're really trying very hard not to resort to these things. But especially, I think the sentence structure, which was I was trying to point out, that's just, you have that everywhere, that these long meandering sentences kind of trying to replicate the thought process that maybe was there in the production itself. So I don't know.
I think it was Michael and then Nicoletta.
I had a question for Kathy. I really liked your discussion of the role that the spirit of Shakespeare plays in reviews, and the way it kind of operates as, like the ghost behind the scene, the power, the authorizing figure. My question is, what do you do when productions themselves, play that card as well? Because, what you see a lot of times with theatrical productions is both for funding, right, and for increased customers or punters. I'm trying to adjust the Atlantic. They'll put Shakespeare forward, and often they will not just put Shakespeare forward, but they'll put a certain concept of Shakespeare forward, like Shakespeare the popularizer, Shakespeare the groundbreaker, or something like that. And so how does the reviewer cope with that? I mean, I grant that maneuver can succeed and can be coped with, but oftentimes it does seem like a bit of a shortcut to make sure that the money comes in. And so how does the reviewer handle that?
I don't know, I feel like it's one of those kind of self-perpetuating loops whereby if critics keep kind of deferring to this idea of the spirit of Shakespeare, and that they're then actually reinforcing the kind of, I suppose, the commercial appeal of that you were discussing. So I feel like those two things kind of feed into each other. I suppose as a critic, maybe if it's been positioned very explicitly in that way in a production, maybe the only way to deal, you can't ignore that in a review, but maybe the way of dealing with that would be to kind of, look at the potential cynicism of that and maybe point that out in writing about it rather than just kind of replicating that vocabulary. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think that the commodity of Shakespeare is much bigger than the power of the reviewers have in force.
But I'm just saying that they're part of it, I think, is what I'm trying to say. Is, well, I don't think they have the power alone to change that, but maybe more calling for like a recognition of being part of that kind of web of commodification around Shakespeare.
My question is more about the comment, because I was just thinking of the market for the reviews in some places on the continent, and that came out of one of the, I suppose, trios of definitions Estelle was giving, the reviewer as a spectator, academic, and journalist. I was just thinking how many of the reviewers in theatres in Germany, or perhaps in France, and countries whose language I speak, are actually academics but have no understanding of Shakespeare studies. So one of the boxes they wouldn't tick is the textual box or the contextual, the early modern stuff, but they will talk a lot about the aesthetics of theatre that they seem to promote or support. So a George Band review is impossible to translate in any language other than that. In terms of giving any details about the production, it's probably an open essay on what he thinks the production should have been like. And I'm sure there are other examples of that. So I think the words dense and sentences or paragraphs by reviewers, like the one I've mentioned, works very well. And I was just wondering whether that's the experience in other countries, that the reviewers as academics are not actually specialists in Shakespeare or have understanding of Shakespeare through English, where it's been mediated through French or German sometimes.
I can try to answer that. As I was saying earlier, that here I think a lot of the reviewers have a bit of a different approach. A lot of that happens on blogs, but a lot of the writers, the young writers, don't really have a formal writing training. But myself, I'm an academic, but I don't have any like textual clue about Shakespeare. I love it, I know that, and I know about theatre, and I write about it. And I think a lot of the broadsheet critics, they're academics as well, and you see it in their writing. I don't know if that's...
Can I just add something about training, because you mentioned like young critics not really having any training, but there's never, in this country, there's never really been a formalised training process for critics, and a lot of theatre critics have studied literature at university. I think that's quite often the background that they're coming from, which obviously kind of informs that engagement with the text perhaps over other elements, which maybe the reverse of that is true in Germany from the sounds of it. But yeah, when you discuss training, I think you can't really talk about training in this country in relation to theatre criticism, because it just doesn't really exist.
But you can in other places,
yes.
And that's the irony, because the training is done in institutes of theatre practice, and there's probably a one-off session on Shakespeare at some point done by somebody who has learned it via some other one-off session. And that creates the tension about reviewing and about finding a space in which to review with broader knowledge, I suppose, of the work that you're reviewing, and that's definitely not in broadsheets.
And the reviewers in Germany, that you have to have gone to a journalist school to work in that newspaper. It's really rare that you have someone jumping in from the side. I actually had an email from someone saying, we have a proper reviewer, thank you. Basically saying you didn't go to a journalism school. So yeah, maybe that's a definite.
We have a question from Michael and then PA, and then I'm going to cut it off.
Yeah, this is very, very quick. Just picking up a chance remark of Anna Gretz just now. You said that the reviewers in broadsheets in Britain are academics. This is news to me.
Mm-hmm. Did I say?
I think in
Germany. Sorry.
In Germany.
Sorry, I meant Germany. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not suggesting that the people who write about theatre in the Guardian, such as Andrew Dixon, are phenomenally
sorry.
informed
Yes, and this is the last question. I'll make it quick. But I mean, two things I just want to say, because not surprisingly, it annoys me the kind of interesting things that go on about work like self-indulgent. Self-indulgent is always used for European long sentences. I find wildly self-indulgent short, sharp remarks by reviewers. So I just think it's really, but it's a serious point underneath that, is that I think we're carrying this through. And also the other thing I just want to say is that what's been interesting to me about thinking about the practice of spectating is that the assignments I've been giving my students in Introduction to London Theatre, which is of course an incredibly marketable piece of little thing that all the schools do, that all the universities do, is to actually undo the relation of writing to theatre to good, bad, go, don't go.
Yeah.
And I think that we're multiplying our methods within our own discourses. Academics are very different. We keep saying the academic, but there isn't one. So we're multiplying our methods within our own discourses, and I think there's ways we can multiply those methods with the students so that the pressure to have to actually say what I thought right? As opposed to the possibility that without stars, a discussion can happen about something that may not be specific, but actually maybe something that people can move in and out and through their own effective spectatorship. I think is also another way of going at this and not being caught by the review hook.
Well, if I may say a closing remark, if I may give myself the last word, as someone who's used reviews a lot in my writing, if I can sort of spring to the defence of reviewers and say I find reviews incredibly useful of giving an impression of society at that time, just as an archival repository, saying more about the reviewer than whatever is reviewed, so that just as a side note. But thank you to all of our panellists and now